Hi, friends, and welcome to the program. Hey, we're headed out west today, headed for the Rocky Mountains and Shelton Ranch Outfitters out in Meeker, Colorado. Our good friends Pete and Judy and Paul and Susan, everybody out there treats us so good every time we come there. I can't wait to get out there and try to fill my archery elk and archery mule deer tag. Now, I should mention, just in case you don't have the Weather Channel where you live, or perhaps you haven't seen the evening news in the last, say, 3 months, the West has experienced the hottest, driest summer they've had in record number of years. In fact, it hasn't been this bad since the Dust Bowl era of the 1930s. So I have adjusted my expectations a little anyway. I figure the hunting's going to be a little tougher. And I got to tell you, my expectations were right on the money, save one little thing. It wasn't a little tougher. It was tremendously hot. Afternoon temperatures in the 80s and 90s had suppressed the elk movement totally, and the deer movement was confined to the first hour or so of daylight. So, you know me, I decided we'll fish for what's biting, we'll try to get on a good mule deer buck, and hope for some cooler weather and a little more elk activity by the end of our week. Hey, I'm your host, Kyle Randall. This is my Wilderness Journal, and we're headed out to the mountains for some real hot hunting right now.
Just as the shadows of that first afternoon began to stretch, Dan and I came across a dandy buck. We actually bounced him up out of his bed down in a draw. All we could do was stand there and watch him slowly walk away, but I'm here to tell you, friends, this was a deer worth hunting, and it certainly gave me hope that maybe we could get this done even in this terrible heat. Long before sunup the next morning, we were set up in the side of that very same draw when I looked up on the hill, and there was my buck, all the way at the top of the next ridge, standing at a fence crossing. I don't know why he was up there, why he wasn't down working his way along this side hill, but as I watched him clear the fence and then slowly make his way around the bull, and as we sat there watching, it suddenly occurred to me, if he stays up there and we're down here, there is no way we can move on him. He was no more than 100 yards away, but the simple truth was he was above us, and as such, if we'd have moved just a little bit, he'd have picked us in a heartbeat. All I could do was just sit there and hope somehow he'd make a mistake. He'd go by something, he'd go over a small ridge, something that would give us a little bit of cover so we could close the distance. Unfortunately, he didn't. He worked all the way around the rim of that bowl as if he knew we were there, all the way out to the road so he could cross the fence and go up in daybed. And the whole of the time he was making that big old circle, I was sitting there motionless, making sure I didn't spook him and thinking to myself, you may have won this time, but trust me, dear, I'm paying attention.
That, friends, was a smoker of a muley buck. He was a gorgeous 4x4 with decent brow tines, certainly a trophy in anybody's book, certainly in mine anyway. And even though he had me pinned that first morning I couldn't get up and take a run at him, I did go to school a little bit. I learned something from him. I knew where he was feeding. I knew which way he had taken to go to bed. And you could bet, come the morning, I'd be putting what I'd learned to use.
As the nearly full moon was now rising the following afternoon, I was still remembering the other thing I learned a long time ago while deer hunting. And never count your chickens before you got 'em plucked and in the pot, yeah. I was at least seeing a few deer. It was late in the afternoon, just before sunset, when a few does and fawns started feeding down off the mountain and out into the alfalfa field in front of where we were set up. It took another half hour before more deer started working their way down. The shadows were almost all the way across the valley floor when another group started working out, including a couple of smaller bucks, followed by at least 2 older, more mature, obviously shooter bucks were working their way down. The problem with them? They were almost a half a mile away. They'd really have to hustle if they were going to get down here in time for me to get a shot before the light faded. I watched these bucks as they leisurely walked down across the valley, headed down toward the horse pasture and probably a drink out of the pond, and I thought to myself, how amazing is it that every time I hunt the West, I'm out there cooking in the sun, especially in the early season, praying for that sun to go down so it'll cool off. And then when it finally does, it never fails. I need to reach back over my shoulder and prop it up for 15 more minutes in order to get a shot. It just seems to always work that way. Some of the deer did in fact work their way into the horse pasture and down to the pond for a drink. Some stayed up on the flat just feeding, but the whole bunch of them didn't seem to be in any hurry to work their way down to the alfalfa where we were set up at a fence crossing. We only had 20, maybe 30 minutes of usable light left. I needed these bucks to work their way down and get out in front of us in order to get a shot before I couldn't see to shoot. Then finally, the deer started moving in our direction. That is, some of them. Two of the biggest bucks, for whatever reason, took a left turn and started feeding back up into the Fire Valley. Some of the younger bucks had made it to the first of two fence crossings they'd have to use in order to get to us. But unfortunately, those bigger bucks, the shooters, they weren't coming anywhere near here, at least not yet. All I could do now was just sit there and hope, listening to my watch tick like thunder in my ears. It truly seemed to be getting darker faster than normal. And then I realized, that isn't my watch ticking like thunder in my ears, it's actually thunder. A weather front was blowing in over the mountain behind us. Obviously, it was going to get dark really fast now. If there was going to be any hope for a shot, these bucks needed to get over here in the next 10 minutes. Yes, I know what you're thinking. It's the same thing I was thinking. No, not too likely. I figured it'd truly take a miracle to get a shooter from the other side of that creek over into the alfalfa field in front of us, so we had even a chance to get a shot before we took a shot. Of lightning. Friends, pretty quick, we were going to need to get off of this mountain. I do remember thinking as I sat there, just my luck to show up in Colorado, the one day it's going to rain in the last 2 months. Still, you couldn't begrudge these folks the rain. They needed it so bad. We'd have another day. All I could think of now really was, I hope that lightning doesn't start any more fires.
The weather closing us out that afternoon wasn't nearly as troubling as seeing all that lightning popping around in the mountains. The state of Colorado already had far more forest fires than they could deal with. We could go to bed that night and get up and tomorrow would be just another day of hunting. That is, unless ours or some one of the neighbors' mountains were on fire. You don't know how scary this is, friends, unless you live in the West, especially in a year like this was. We could just say our prayers and try to sleep in hopes that nobody was ringing the alarm bell when we got up.
And fortunately, there were no calls to fight fire that next morning. We were watching a group of spike bulls working their way to bed. It was warm and pretty windy, but it was clear, and we couldn't see smoke in any direction. What we could see was,
That's a bunch of elk.
yeah, a whole bunch of elk.
Just about.
Unfortunately, they were already well above us, on their way up the mountain and headed to bed for the day. It was about then I spotted a group of bachelor bucks working their way around the hill below us, and I suddenly realized, if we grab our stuff and run right now, we might be able to get out ahead of them. They're going to cross where that big buck did the other morning, and we might get there ahead of them.
Friends, I could show you how far we had to go, how hot and miserable it was trying to get down and around and back out in front of those bucks before they crossed the road and went up to bed that morning. I could show you that. Or you could just look at the sweat running down the back of my neck as we got skidded into that last spot, saw them coming up the field. We actually made it. Now all we needed was just a little bit of help from the deer.
With literally seconds to spare, we'd made it into position. The deer were already headed up the hill more or less toward us. There was one shooter buck in this group, and if he would come just a little bit out in the open, he was only 56 yards, kind of far, but not too far. What I needed for him to do was stop in an opening where I had a shot before they got to the road. Yeah, that's what I needed, and I went right on needing it. That buck never uncovered.
Close.
He passed by at less than 40 yards, but there was so much brush there was no way we could take a shot. All Dan and I could do was just sit there, watch him walk across the road, hop the fence, and wander right on out of my life. We hunted hard all the following day, but it wasn't till sunset when we actually saw some critters. I decided to try calling at these 3 spike bulls a little bit. They obviously weren't legal. It takes 4 points on a side to be legal in this part of Colorado, but you never know when there's an elk traveling with a group that you can't see. And besides, this was one of the only times we saw any elk movement during the daylight. Unfortunately, I didn't see any mature bulls responding to my calls. What we did see was a whole bunch of cows and calves and a couple of other bulls working their way out into one of those hayfields. And before long, our 3 fellas decided they were going to wander over and join the party. No legal bulls ever answered my call, and I didn't see any with this group of spikes. Still, at least we were seeing some elk, and I can't say that nothing responded to my calling. We did have a cow with 2 calves come to within about 40 yards and check us out. And being how it's legal to take a cow elk on an archery tag in Colorado, I certainly could have taken a shot had I wanted to. Believe me when I tell you, friends, trying to archery elk hunt in 90-plus degree heat, well, let's just say it's a real tough ticket.
With temperatures that afternoon in the 90s, I wasn't really surprised we weren't seeing much. Still, our week was beginning to wear on, and we had to make a decision. The elk weren't moving at all, at least not in the daylight. There were plenty of cows and calves. We could see them at first light and at last light, and if you know anything about elk, you know where cows and calves are, bulls will soon be. The problem was there wasn't hardly any movement in the daylight in the camera hours. At least the deer were moving some in that first hour, 2 hours of each day. And where I'm from, friends, when it comes to hunting, at least some is always better than none.
That next day we did manage to get on some deer, We'd seen a couple of bucks, including this high, tight rack 3x3, working their way down through an alfalfa field and then headed up to bed. I sat there thinking for a couple of minutes, maybe this really isn't what I'd consider a shooter, but maybe we ought to try working down and around and getting out in front of this buck. Isn't it funny how your opinion of a deer changes as the days of a hunt go by? In the beginning of the week, you're thinking, man, this is a great place. They have awesome deer. No way I'm shooting anything but a real smoker. And then, with a day or two left, you're thinking, yeah, the truth was, first or last day, he just wasn't a shooter.
And then there was just one day left in my hunt in Colorado. And when Paul said, you know what, we're not seeing much, how about we try hiking up over this hill and looking into a little bowl I know of that stays shadier later in the day, I thought, what could it hurt? We could try it. That's what you have to do when it's tough. You just have to keep trying.
After a short climb to the top of the ridge, Paul and I worked ourselves along into a place where we figured we could glass and see most of that bowl without being seen ourselves. We got to looking around and holy smokes, there was the monster 4x4, the very same buck we'd seen the very first day, the one we'd tried to set up on and had loop around us. He was already 3/4 of the way up out of the bowl, working his way along with a couple of does and fawns. I thought, man, there's probably no way I'm ever going to get close enough for a shot, but it's the last day. I gotta try. Paul and I made a hasty plan. He would squat down and try to keep an eye on the buck as I dropped below the rim so as not to skyline myself and work my way around. In my head, I knew that a lot of things were going to have to break in my favor in order for this to work, but I also knew that if you never try, if you never take the chance, well, you never bump into a deer like this blocking your path. Not only was there a fork and horn, there was a doe right beside me. There were deer coming up out of this bowl we hadn't seen, and they were all around me. All I could do was just sit there, wait for him to go by, and then creep ahead a little bit. I kept looking, and here was another big old buck. A huge 3x3 with a big sword up one side was standing there looking back. He'd seen something, but he hadn't spooked. This buck was only 50, 60 yards out, already within the outside edge of my bow range. It was decision time in Colorado. Did I take a run at this buck? Did I continue on and try to find the other buck? It was the last day. The sun was coming up. The temperature was rising with it, and yeah, I try to never look a gift deer in the mouth, especially on the last day. I started creeping forward to get into position for a shot and immediately bumped into a big old forked horn buck. This deer wasn't 30 yards away and fortunately feeding. I looked over, and the big 3x3 was actually coming down the edge of the bowl. He was getting closer. Ever so carefully, I eased forward to a spot I figured I had an opening, a chance for a shot through the brush. And there he was. He'd seen something. He was looking right at me, but he didn't spook. In fact, he took a couple of steps closer. And again he caught movement. I just froze. We stood there in the mother of all stare-downs. I couldn't believe it. I'd come this far. All I needed was for this buck to just turn his head, to look the other way. And then finally, he started moving again. There was another opening. I drew the bow. I lifted my body as high as I thought I'd dare in order to get over the brushing.
Wow. Did you see that? Hey, do you see that? Yep. Man. Wow. Oh well. Been a great week. We give it a try. Last day. That's how it goes, friends. Sometimes you eat venison backstrap, and sometimes it's bologna sandwiches. We did our very best to beat the heat, but in the end, all we left Colorado with was a sunburn and some great memories. That was obviously the cameraman's fault.
Yeah.
Friends, I guess sometimes it really is too hot to hunt. Still, we had a great time. We saw plenty of critters despite the weather, and I want you to know that Pete and Judy and Paul and Susan, everybody out at the Sheltons did everything in their power to put that together, and we could have certainly filled both our tags. I could have shot a smaller buck. I certainly could have taken a cow elk. That's legal on an archery tag. I was the one that decided to wait for something special, and you know, I got it. I got a truly special trip with some really wonderful people, and while I'm handing out thanks, I need to thank Miss T and certainly Dan the cameraman for pounding up and down the mountains, sweating through that hunt with me. We really did have a good time, and if that's something that interests you, if you know archery, elk, or mule deer are your thing, you get a hold of Pete and Judy, Paul, Susan, anybody out there at Shelton's, and they're going to show you the very same great hunting and the very same great effort that they always show us. Hey, I hope I see you out there. I hope you're stocking up on a big old bull or a nice buck of your own, and if I do, well, you know we're going to stop and share a cup and a fire, and if I don't see you out there, friends, well, at the very least, I hope to see you right back here for another adventure from my Wilderness Journal.
Thanks again, Pete and Judy, Paul and Susan, everybody out at Shelton's.